This conference will now be recorded.
All right, thank you for joining us. My name is Erin Davis. I'm the Director of Janesville Mobilizing for Change, or JM4C. Today I have with me Julia Sherman, the Outreach Specialist for the University of Wisconsin Alcohol Policy Project. Today's presentation is part 2 of Alcohol Policy for Local Elected Officials. During the presentation, I will have everyone on mute, but please feel free to type questions into the chat box. You'll be able to access both part 1 and part 2 of the presentation at www.jm4c.org. Part 1 is already available and part 2 will be made available as soon as the recording is ready. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you very much, Erin. And thank you folks for coming back for part 2. And I am trying to move my slides. There we go. As we discussed in part 1, we looked mostly at alcohol licensing and Wisconsin's basic alcohol policy framework. In this second part, we're going to look at the related policies and practices that also have an impact on alcohol use in a community and how you can consider them, decide which ones might be appropriate for you, and then a few thoughts about adopting them. It's important to recognize that the alcohol environment in your community is larger than alcohol licensing. It goes beyond licensing places to sell and serve alcohol. It's a huge part of it, but there's also other issues that are dramatically related. One of the ways that communities often measure how their alcohol environment is doing is to find out what percentage of your police calls for service are alcohol related. We don't in Wisconsin require our police to code all calls for service. And by calls for service, I mean someone called and asked the police because there's been a crime. But more often, it's also things like vandalism, petty theft. Neighbors have called about noise. Neighbors have called because they think there's domestic violence going on in your home. And these are often alcohol related, but in Wisconsin, we don't indicate which of those calls for service are alcohol related. But in the occasions that I've talked to local law enforcement officers and especially chiefs of police, they can give me a good estimate of the number of their calls for service that are alcohol related. And I've never been given a number that is lower than 50%. Most communities can estimate how many of things like domestic violence, vandalism, assault, sexual assault, completed suicide, and gun violence, a significant amount of gun violence, is really alcohol related. When you do that, you get a number that often surprises local elected officials, and it really makes it clear that a big chunk of our alcohol related problems in our communities, they're ending up on the property tax in the form of emergency services and police support. Alcohol policy goes way beyond licensing, and the beauty of it is municipal policy can actually move prevention upstream. It doesn't control individual actions, but it makes the default choice, the safer choice, the choice for moderation that the vast majority of people want to choose anyway. For examples would be we build sidewalks because we don't want people walking in the street. It's less safe. This is just the same thing. It doesn't control individual actions, but it gives people the right choice to make, and it makes it the default choice. There are plenty of models. They exist, but we usually need to adapt them in Wisconsin because more states have statewide alcohol control, or they have state authorities that control these sorts of ordinances. Unlike other states, local elected officials in Rock County throughout Wisconsin have a great deal of authority to actually create their own alcohol environment because municipalities have the ability to adopt ordinances in areas where the state law is silent. I'll give you a number of examples just up front. We don't have a statewide public intoxication law. Statewide, we don't require our bartenders to be sober. We don't screen products, alcohol products, before they go on the shelves. You can't create crimes as a municipal leader, but you can make certain actions illegal. And that's just a citation that shows up in your municipal court. So as you develop your approach to alcohol policy and alcohol related outcomes in your community, once again, go back to something we discussed in depth last week, and that is, what is your vision for the community alcohol environment? Nobody says our vision is a community where the downtown is ridden by alcohol related violence on the weekend, where domestic assaults and completed suicides are frequent and almost always alcohol related. Nobody wants to live there. You have created a vision of your community that is positive, a wide range of healthy options for your community, retail opportunities to support the services and products that people that live in your community need. Outline that vision, and it'll make it easier to define what your approach to the other ordinances would be. What aspects of excessive drinking are impacting your municipal budget? Is it your share of the cost of the jail? Is it police overtime for festivals? When you see something that impacts your local budget, that's an area you need to look at. Another issue communities also deal with is how you deal with what we call amenity issues: noise, littering, public urination, things that are likely to happen around licensed premises. I know that Janesville does not have a functioning noise ordinance. That might be something you'd want to look at, for the simple reason that noise complaints is how most underage drinking parties are found, and that since we have a statewide social host law, it doesn't allow you to cite anyone under age 18 for hosting it, but you could cite them for underage drinking and for a noise violation for the person that organized the party. When you go through and start thinking of creating the alcohol environment in areas outside of licensing, the first thing you need to determine is what ordinances you already have on the books that are unenforced. But to do that, you need to know what's on the books. If you go to the website, and there will be a slide at the end that gives you the website address, you will be able to download a municipal inventory that allows you to go through your municipal ordinances and determine which of the basic alcohol related policies you already have on the books, those you don't have on the books. If you've got things on the books that are unenforced, you can then enforce them. Then you look and see what gaps you have that you might be able to fill, gaps in state law or gaps in your individual ordinances that you can fill locally with an ordinance. In these discussions, after you've completed your inventory, be sure to include the police chief or someone he designates, other law enforcement leaders, public health, and your municipal judge in those discussions. This is not a big secret. You need to be loud and clear as to what you are doing. You will be surprised how many people are very, very glad that you're looking at improving the overall alcohol environment. And once you determine how much of it's ending up on the property taxes, they're going to be even happier. You're going to need to adopt an incremental approach. Simple truth is, it usually takes a couple of years to rewrite your alcohol-related laws, the licensing, the renewal policy, examine what's on the books and what should be enforced, and which ones you might even want to repeal. But that incremental approach also allows you to ease the community into it. There's no reason you need to make this big change. The changes will only become evident over time. There are no magic bullets here. So if you adopt an incremental approach, it allows you to take a step, say, adopt a sober server ordinance, see if how much enforcement manpower it took, see how enforcement can be done, and then move on to the next issue. Most communities that are working on this start with underage drinking. The minimum legal drinking age of age 21 is settled law. Even the industry isn't trying real hard to repeal it anymore. So it's always a great place to start because you will have community support for it. We know that youth that are too young to even try to purchase alcohol from a retail shop, what they do is they pilfer it from homes and garages. We know that the age of first drink in Wisconsin is usually one of those summers during middle school or as they enter high school. We know that because we've asked and they've told us that. So begin there by looking at how reducing the availability. The next step is kids then when they get into high school a little bit, they will try to purchase probably from a convenience store. All right. In those cases, that's why you need alcohol age compliance checks. Sometimes adults are willing to be straw buyers, so you need to watch your click and collect. You see, some adults will allow underage drinking in their home. That is a violation of state law, and since you've adopted Chapter 125 into your ordinances of local ordinance as well, it's legal if it's just their own offspring are in the home. In other words, if you have a family gathering and the parents there allow their children to drink, there's no violation of the law. But more often than not, what we find is it's a parent who's willing to go to the basement or go to the other side of the house and engages in a little willful deafness and a little willful blindness and says he just chooses not to know what's going on in the basement. That individual is hosting an underage drinking party, even if they don't provide the alcohol. All right. There are, and there are adults who will purchase alcohol for kids. Hopefully that number is way down. But regardless, both adults who purchase alcohol for youth and adults who simply allow their property to be used by youth or rent a hotel room for use as an underage drinking location, those can be cited under things that are on the books right now. You're going to need multiple approaches to get at underage drinking because kids are smart and they try different things at different ages. You just saw the different ways kids try to access alcohol. So you need to have different approaches to hammering down, shutting off those spigots for them. Alcohol age compliance checks, that is a very effective way of cutting off commercial access to alcohol at your local retailers. Enforcement of the social host law, I just spoke about. People that allow underage drinking in their home. There is a social host law on the books. This one's been held up by the courts. It carries a $500 forfeiture if it's enforced as a local ordinance. But we also know that little kids are pilfering alcohol out of refrigerators, many of them in unlocked garages. So some communities are now distributing refrigerator locks in the areas immediately around the high school and the middle school or other areas like recreation centers where kids gather. You can purchase these locks using money from your annual grant for the Alliance for Wisconsin Youth or other things such as drug-free community money. There are ways to work with local retailers to keep the cost down. Perhaps you work with the retailer, he moderates his markup, you pay for a portion, and then you can subsidize these purchases. But refrigerator locks, especially in garages, are a great way of denying the very young drinker the opportunity to get alcohol. You deny them the opportunity to engage in underage drinking. And then, of course, at every opportunity, encourage your community and parents to use the new Small Talks uh, program that is provided by DHS. This is really far more thorough than the old Parents Who Host Lose the Most. It provides an outline of the opportunities to talk to your kids, conversation starters, and 3 quick points. It's not about one big talk anymore. It's about multiple talks with youth, and they really provide all the materials we need to hold those talks. When we create a positive alcohol environment in the community, it's easy to overlook the municipal sign ordinance because nowhere in that sign ordinance does it say alcohol. You can't just ban alcohol advertising in your community. That would be a violation of the First Amendment because, believe it or not, commercial speech has First Amendment rights too. But you can adopt a really comprehensive sign code that limits alcohol advertising, especially alcohol advertising that is more likely to reach youth. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has said all alcohol advertising should be at least 36 inches from the ground. These two pictures up here, this is bollard advertising. Bollard advertising is those little signs that slip over your bollards, your parking lot safety measures, and they are frequently alcohol advertising, and they're short. Let's be honest, every single one of us, including me at 4'11", towers over these signs. So who's seeing it? 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds. You can't limit bollard advertising for tobacco, but you can say you don't want bollard advertising in your community, or you make it temporary so it can only be up for a brief period of time. Another way is that limit the amount of a window that can be covered with signage. A lot of the signage in your convenience store windows tends to be for alcohol related products and their prices. You can limit the amount of advertising period that goes into a window, and then it's enforced by your building inspector as part of your sign code. Bollard advertising especially, you need to get that off if you can. We approached Quick Trip last year because it appears Quick Trip has a lot of alcohol related bollard advertising, and they said they would simply obey the law of all the communities. They didn't want to establish a precedent of removing it for one product. So working with communities across Wisconsin, we are able to check the sign code, see if bollard advertising is allowed, and if it isn't, we call the building inspector, who then just gives them a call and has it removed. In a couple communities in Dane County, it was easier for the building inspector to ask the police to handle it, and they just sent a couple officers over to say, take it down, and it came down quickly. I don't know whether they intended to break the law, but we do know that there's a lot of bollard advertising. A great deal of it is in front of Quick Trips. And if your community doesn't allow or limits bollard advertising, it's worth checking your local Quick Trips to get it down, because nobody needs to advertise alcohol to 6-year-olds. And the final thing to consider is that if you have public property, most public property already bans tobacco advertising, because you're not acting as a censor at that point. You are acting as the good steward of this public property by not advertising it in a way that could be harmful to the children or adults in your community. Several communities have banned alcohol advertising from their public transportation, from any publicly owned property, kiosks, bus shelters, things that you have in rec centers, um, outbuildings at your parks. You can ban alcohol advertising from all of those, and it is not a problem with the First Amendment. If anyone is interested in the legal documents that support that approach, let me know. I will be happy to send it to you. You can also find it on the website of the Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth at Johns Hopkins University. Once you deal with underage drinking, then you need to look at adult binge drinking. And I don't mean you have to cure underage drinking, but beginning with underage drinking allows you to ease into alcohol policies so that people realize we're not talking about prohibition. We're talking about supporting people that want to do the right thing. The simple truth is that the research shows that youth are also impacted by the adult drinking in the area. This shouldn't come as a shock to anyone, but we have to recognize it. So when there's a lot of adult binge drinking in your community, it does have an impact on the children. We know that 24% of the adults in Wisconsin self-report binge drinking about once a week. Only 8% of them are in fact alcohol dependent. So we have far more people in our community binge drinking than we have that are actually alcohol dependent. So it's not a matter of alcohol dependent. It's just a matter of a really bad habit that endangers both the adults and makes it harder for us to reduce the rate of underage drinking. We know that adult binge drinking is fueled by an overconcentration of alcohol outlets. That's why it's important to do the mapping we talked about last week and take the steps to resolve over clusters and overconcentrations of outlets. We know that binge drinking is also supported by overserving by licensees, which you are looking at already through your place of last drink compilation, which allows you to identify those licensees that show a pattern of overserving using anonymized data collected from drunk driving citations. Where licensees are overserving, you can go back and say, you have a problem here. It's best done in collaboration with local law enforcement. And when we look at over multiple years in Wisconsin, or pardon me, in Dane County, we see that the pattern is once you say, hey, you've got a number of people reporting drinking here after they leave that are picked up for drunk driving, they look at their policies and practices. They look at their menu. They look at their servers to see if there's a problem. We, of course, also have the acceptability of a community, the social norms within a community. If it's acceptable to consume alcohol excessively, that's going to encourage binge drinking because we are social animals. One of the things you can do within your community to help reduce the acceptability of excessive alcohol consumption and support your recovery community is to create an alcohol-free public park. I've been surprised by the support that you can get from people that are organizing recovery groups, your local treatment people, treatment options, whether they are medical or they are sober housing. They understand how hard it is to remain sober in Wisconsin. So they like alcohol-free public parks, and they also like ordinances that reduce the amount of alcohol advertising in a community. It's hard to maintain your sobriety in Wisconsin, and having an alcohol-free park or two in your community really helps them do that. So what are some of those things that we talk about? Well, enforce the laws of overserving, beginning with a place of last drink compilation. You don't enforce directly from that, but communities that have found one or two licensees that were seriously overserving over a period of time have sent in undercover officers to see what's going on. And often what they find is that everybody in there is drunk. The servers are drunk. The patrons are very intoxicated, and the licensee himself, well, he or she may not even be on the premises. In Waukesha, when they started to enforce their laws against overserving, they found it wasn't effective, and so they adopted a sober server ordinance because they wanted to go back in and make sure that the servers were not also impaired. The Tavern League of Wisconsin calls a licensee supervised drinking. They that
Julia, we seem to have lost you. All right, we seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. Hopefully Julia will be back with us in a moment. Looks like her screen went blank. Julia?
yes.
Okay, I can hear you now. We lost you for a moment. You were
Okay,
talking about the sober server ordinance and what the Tavern League considers um,
okay, good.
assisted supervised drinking.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, in Wausau, they discovered that half the time their officers were called to a particular location, that part of the problem was in fact impaired servers. So they adopted a sober server ordinance um, with the intention that they could reduce the calls for service and also they could hold people responsible. They were not going to run a disorderly house. They were going to have their sober servers. Everybody is handling sober server ordinances as secondary enforcement. I do not know of any police department that goes from bar to bar breath checking the servers. It's simply if they show up at a bar where there's been a fight has broken out, where there's been violence, and they suspect the servers are intoxicated, then they would give them a PBT and go from there. Another thing you can do is to carefully, as you move into click and collect location, as you authorize click and collect at different locations in your community, enforce the agreements with the retailers. Or better yet, make them ordinances so that if they don't follow the agreements, that you have recourse as a community. Once you authorize click and collect alcohol sales by extending your licensed premises to be part of the parking lot, that can't be undone just because it's a problem. It can be undone if you have cause on it. You've just extended the licensed premises, much as if you added a party room in the basement or added a storeroom in the back. But if you have a special ordinance that regulates click and collect locations, all those promises that retailers will make when they want you to extend the licensed premises, you can then enforce them.
Julia, I've had a question on the click and collect. Um, do click and collect sales need to be face to face? Can they be online? What is the regulation regarding that?
At this time, Wisconsin still requires face to face sales. So, what usually happens is, assuming that you have extended the licensed premises so that alcohol can be delivered to your parking lot, is you basically create a shopping list, but you don't complete the sale until the individual is then in their parking spot that's part of the licensed premises. The individual goes out, pulls in, someone from the store who is in fact a licensed operator, our term for a licensed bartender, goes out, swipes the credit card, then completing the sale after determining that the driver of the car at least is age 21. That's the minimum. It has to be a face to face sale. You can create a grocery list, but some of the services like Shipt and Instacart, they actually deliver the alcohol to your home. Those can't be used for alcohol in Wisconsin. And I'm really impressed with the number of communities that are just saying, no, if you want to buy alcohol, you have to come into the store. They're not allowing alcohol sales through click and collect. And that's the best way to do it. One of the things that we realize is that with click and collect, they're just making promises. And there are an amazing array of situations that really would you don't want to handle in a parking lot, especially a parking lot in Wisconsin in January. What if someone suspects that an individual is intoxicated and rolls up and wants to buy more alcohol? What do you do in situations where you've got one driver who is 21, but everybody else in the car appears to be a teenager and they're buying a bunch of frozen pizzas and alcohol? These are sorts of situations that really would put just supermarket staff really on the front lines. And that's not something you want to do. Click and collect is a great idea, But let's be honest, nobody has to have alcohol. If they want to buy alcohol, they can come into the store and pick it up at the desk in front. You could make an arrangement for people if they wanted to order alcohol and have their shopping done for them, they can, and they would simply pick it all up at the customer service desk. There are ways you can accomplish much of the goals of click and collect. But right now, the only way that you can legally do it is if they come to a parking spot that is part of the licensed premises. An individual who is a licensed operator goes out to the car, they see that ID, and then they complete the sale, usually with a little scanner that fits on some sort of handheld device that's Wi-Fi connected. That's the best way to approach click and collect these days. There are a number of communities that have adopted ordinances on this. If you go to my website, you'll find them there. There's a summary of them on the website. There are other local options that you can use to help reduce adult binge drinking. You can adopt and enforce an open intoxicant or public intoxication ordinance. We don't have in Wisconsin a public intoxication law. Many communities have adopted public intoxication ordinances not with the goal of somehow criminalizing or punishing people, but with the idea of getting them to safety. These are especially popular in college communities. Communities that have ATV trails going through them, they find open intoxicant ordinances to be very useful because ATVs are transportation devices. They are not transportation vehicles. And that small distinction allows you to cruise around town with an open beer unless there is an open intoxicant ordinance in that community. I know it feels like a distinction without a difference, but when you see someone on an ATV cruising through town with an open can of beer, it becomes really clear. And so if you have any ATV trails or ATV friendly areas in your community, you should have an open intoxicant ordinance simply because you don't want people to become impaired as they drive around town in the vehicle. They can hurt themselves, they can hurt others, and they can hurt property. You should also consider adopting license conditions for your picnics and your festival licenses. Often folks don't realize they can do this, but you can stick a license condition on those just like you could any other alcohol license. And in the case of the festival conditions, we know what helps regulate alcohol when it's served outdoors. It's also really handy these days because a lot of licensees are trying to expand their licensed premises to their parking lots or their decks or other areas that are adjacent to the bar to accommodate social distancing. These license conditions are often just very, very simple, but they would apply also as you allow these other expanded licensed areas outside. For example, sure, you understand if they want to put tables in their parking lot, but you still need a perimeter around those tables so that people don't wander away with a beer. And you might want to make sure that they're using plastic uh, utensils and drinking cups outside so that you don't have glass hitting the floor and breaking. So look at the picnic festival licenses and see if those are conditions that you would want to adopt. I know that the city of Oshkosh is working on adopting a special set of license conditions that will apply to, well, actually, it's an ordinance that will regulate all the expanded areas, and they will all expire on October 31st, which is a great idea because you don't want to permanently expand the licensed premises. It doesn't have to be October 31, it can be December 31. But the fact is, you want to make this a time limited situation because if you expand the licensed premises to accommodate social distancing now, and it does not have a time certain that it ends on it, you've just expanded the licensed premises so their entire parking lot can be turned into part of the bar at a later date, and that may not be your intention. The other thing you can do that will help reduce adult binge drinking is to ban flat rate or time limited drink specials. I know a lot of people became concerned about this when Madison tried it, but they did it as an agreement. If they had adopted it as an ordinance, they wouldn't have had any trouble. And they were advised to do that by several people. They decided to do it as agreements that they achieved among all the bar owners in a certain part of State Street. Unfortunately, that also appeared to be a restraint of trade issue. So that is what got them in trouble. Not that they had an ordinance that banned flat rate or time limited drink specials. It's that they tried to get around adopting an ordinance and they ran afoul of other aspects of the law. So please, if you find that one of your problems is flat rate or time limited drink specials, adopt a ban on them. It really helps reduce um, adult binge drinking. Somebody comes up and says, buy it now or everything's going to be more expensive. Do you want one more round before happy hour ends? People will buy one more round. And even if they don't want to drink it, they will because it's a sunk cost at that point and they're going to move ahead. You'll probably want to review your license process. We talked extensively about this, but remember, you can involve the entire community in your alcohol licensing process because it helps you identify small issues you can resolve, as opposed to having them become police-related problems at a later date. You'll also want to watch for the oversaturation of alcohol outlets. I know you've got that great population-based limit on Class A's, but you still need to look at the issues of clustering because everyone in Wisconsin needs to consider issues of clustering. Look and see if your licensee discipline is consistent and fair, or if you discipline licensees. Far too many communities in Wisconsin fail to limit licensees until you have real problems, such as stabbings, gunfire, or disorderly bars that really wreak havoc on an entire area. And then finally, are you using license conditions, or you could use an ordinance to mitigate amenity issues? It's amazing how many small issues will rise to the level of a real problem if they're not addressed over a period of years. A noise ordinance can help you tell bars to be calm. You could use license conditions to help mitigate a noise issue at one licensee. You could use a license condition to mitigate littering at another licensee, or noise that comes from the parking lot at a third. Some of these you wouldn't want to adopt a full ordinance for, but you could use a license condition very effectively because license conditions, once they become part of the license, you can sanction that licensee if he fails to respect it. But once again, that gets back to licensee discipline. Don't adopt it if you're not willing to enforce it. Don't make the police the bad guys here. It's not about the ticket, it's about enforcing the laws and the license conditions.
Julia, we have a question about clustering.
Yes,
What is the recommended clustering level?
the CDC took a big pass on that one. There are no numerical targets for clustering because there are so many variables. Um, you know, Right now, the tools we have for measuring alcohol outlet density treat a bar that has 5 people the same as it treats a bar that has 500. Obviously, that's not fair, and it really would skew any results. So, what people have been doing in Wisconsin is looking at areas where you see clustering and then look at the outcomes. Are you seeing levels of alcohol related disorder increasing in that area? Are there complaints from the neighborhood about littering, public urination, other things like that, noise? If in fact you're starting to see the complaints rise and you can look and see that there are people there significant number of licensees, and because they're your bars, you're going to know how many people are in each of them. At that point, once you see those problems begin to rise, you got a cluster. At that point, it's going to be hard to bring it down, but you can refrain from making the problem worse. I've seen local police do this very effectively. Um, there was one community where they had another retailer came in. He was an existing retailer, good guy. It was a drugstore, and they wanted to add alcohol. And very nicely, the chief of police simply said, "Well, let's look at this. We already have 3 licensees on that corner and 4 more within a half mile. Do you think we really need another licensee in that area?" Well, when it was put like that, they just denied the license. If they'd gone ahead and approved the license, they would have lost the ability when problems began to back away. That's why mapping is so important. You can look at a map and a picture really does have 1,000 words. I'm sorry the CDC does not have numerical targets. I've been disappointed by that myself, but understanding all the variables and the different licensing systems in the states, I understand why any set of standards they put out, it wouldn't work everywhere. So they've just stepped aside on that issue right now. It doesn't mean you can't set standards for yourself. You already have when it comes to the number of off-premises sales you want per person. So you're perfectly capable at setting your own standards. And I'd be happy to work with you, but I think your very capable municipal attorney working with your health department could also come up with standards of when it's time to say, no, we have enough in that area for both Class A and Class B. Obviously, they're different. So you need to have standards for each.
Thank you, Julia.
Any others at this point?
No others at this point.
All righty, thank you. And I do apologize for losing you guys for a bit. As I pointed out last week, there are a lot of resources out there. My offer to send anyone who would like a copy of the Wisconsin League of Municipality book on alcohol licensing, it does not address these other issues that we've talked about today, but it's great for the material we covered last week, and that's kind of a standing offer. If you go to my website, and that is the https://law.wisc.edu web, there is an entire section on alcohol licensing, density. There is a Wisconsin specific memo on using the CDC guide, because since we regulate alcohol locally, some aspects of that are going to be more useful to you, and some aspects of that we need to modify a little bit. But that's covered there. In addition, there is a section on some of the ordinances communities have adopted. Sober server, underage under the influence ordinances. In those cases, very few communities have adopted them, but some communities did have a problem with kids that would say they've been drinking with their parent. The police would find them with measurable levels of blood alcohol, and a parent nowhere to be seen. But if the parent was willing to say they had been drinking with the youth, there was literally nothing the police could do. So for those communities, they adopted ordinances that make it illegal to have measurable blood alcohol in your system if you're under 21 and your parent is not present, parent or guardian is not present. There's a whole list of these. Basically, they allow you to go through and address the problems that you have within your community. Things like sober server, we increasingly find communities want to have. The American Public Health Association earlier this year identified 13 policies and practices that they think states should adopt. And in Wisconsin, a lot of them need to be adopted at the local level, which is great. So we created this infographic that lists them all. On the other side, the reverse, it is how you adopt them in Wisconsin. So things like alcohol age compliance checks, sober server, things like that, compiling place of last drink. They're all listed there. And then on the reverse, if has how to adopt them in Wisconsin. If you'd like me to send you a copy of it, I would be happy to once I'm readmitted to the law school building. But if you'd like to just look it over for now, you can download it from the website. There's a tab on the side for infographics, and it's the one at the top because it's our most recent one. Lots of communities are looking at their alcohol environment and seeing if their ordinances are steering them in the right direction. The municipal inventory that would help you begin that work is also located on my website. It's been reformatted recently to help people do it with as little personal interaction as possible. It was reformatted basically so you can do it remotely online or by talking to folks on the phone. So that's just one of the resources you'll find there. So thank you for coming and listening. And if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those, Erin.
All right, so now I'm going to open it up to everyone. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask Julia before we finish? Okay, well, I'm not hearing any. I
Okay.
did unmute everybody and I'm not seeing any in the chat box. So thank you very much, Julia. We really appreciate it. And we know how to reach you if we have any questions.
Right, great. And as you'll see, my remote phone is also listed there. And if a question occurs to you later, feel free to drop me an email.
All right, thank you, Julia.
Thank you, everyone.